He walked into the courthouse to testify, nothing more. But within seconds, a cop's shove sent him crashing to the floor, blood streaking across the cold marble. No one moved to help, until a voice revealed the truth. He was the Navy SEAL who once carried men out of gunfire. From the moment he stood back up in silence, the whole country was forced to listen. The courthouse steps in downtown Birmingham were alive that morning, buzzing with voices, echoing with the shuffle of shoes against the stone. Cameras clustered like vultures near the main doors, reporters murmured into microphones, and lawyers hurried past with briefcases clutched like shields. It was the sort of day when the air itself felt heavy with expectation, and most people who walked through those doors wore it on their faces. The stiff set of a jaw, the narrowed focus of eyes already preparing for battle. But not David Cole. He moved slowly, not because he lacked strength, but because there was no rush in him, no urgency to prove he belonged. 60 years had carved quiet lines into his dark skin, softened his hair into silver, but his back remained straight as a rifle barrel. He wore a plain navy jacket, pressed but unremarkable, and in his hand he carried only one thing, a small, worn flash drive sealed inside a transparent case. No medals pinned to his chest, no uniform announcing who he once was. To anyone glancing his way, he was just another older black man weaving through the crowd. The noise of reporters dulled around him, as though the world itself failed to notice. He didn't need their cameras. He didn't want them. He had come here for one reason, to testify. Inside the courthouse lobby, the ceilings arched high above polished marble floors. The space was grand, but indifferent, the kind of place built to remind people of power rather than justice. David's shoes made soft, steady taps as he crossed the floor, and he caught the faint reflection of himself in the glass of a display case. Just a man carrying something small in his hand, though the weight of it was enormous. He remembered what Eric had said the night before when they sat together in his cramped apartment, surrounded by old war photos and the steady hum of an oxygen machine. "You don't have to do this, Dave. They'll chew you up." David had placed his hand on Eric's shoulder and smiled. "We don't walk away from the fight just because we're tired. You taught me that." Eric had gone quiet then, eyes glistening in the dim light, the stump of his leg shifting under a worn blanket. He'd nodded, not because he agreed, but because he knew David well enough to know there was no changing his mind. Now, standing at the threshold of the courtroom wing, David felt the same quiet certainty pressing against his chest. This wasn't about winning applause or headlines. It wasn't even about clearing a friend's name. It was about something larger, a system too willing to look the other way, too comfortable pretending men like him were invisible once their service was done. He paused at the security checkpoint. A guard waved him forward without looking twice, scanning the case in his hand. The flash drive passed through, unremarkable to everyone but David. Inside it, buried in files and dates and sworn statements, was the kind of evidence that could tear open a department, strip the shine from a dozen badges, and show the public what had been festering beneath the surface all along. The guard handed it back, muttering, "You're clear." David nodded. "Thank you." He slipped the case into his palm and continued down the hall. His steps echoed faintly, joining the rhythm of heels and polished shoes all around him. He was just one figure among many, indistinguishable to anyone who wasn't looking closely. But if you did look, if you caught the way his eyes moved, sharp and steady, you might notice something unusual. Not defiance exactly, but the memory of it. A quiet knowledge that once, in another world, men had followed his orders into places they might never have walked out of. That was the thing about David Cole. He didn't carry his past like a banner. He carried it like a scar under the fabric of his jacket, unseen but unforgotten. He stopped outside courtroom 4B and rested his hand briefly on the cool wood of the door. The noise inside was muffled but alive. Lawyers arguing, the shuffle of papers, a cough from the gallery. He took a slow breath and glanced at the seal etched into the wall above the door, words chiseled deep about liberty and justice. They looked permanent, untouchable. But David knew better. Words carved in stone could be ignored as easily as words whispered in the dark. From down the hall came the sudden burst of a camera flash. A young journalist brushed past him, nearly knocking the case from his hand, muttering apologies before darting inside. David didn't flinch. He steadied the flash drive in his grip, lifted his chin, and followed. The wooden benches were already half filled with citizens, reporters, even a group of law students scribbling notes. They hardly looked at him. To them, he was just a late arrival, another body finding a seat, and David let them believe it. The less they saw, the better. He moved toward the front, where a clerk was organizing files at her desk. She barely glanced up as he approached. "Yes?" she asked, her voice clipped, distracted by the stack of motions in her hands. "I was called to testify in the Johnson case," David said quietly. He tapped the small case in his hand. "I have evidence for the court." The clerk extended her hand automatically. "I can take that." David hesitated. His voice remained calm but firm. "I was instructed to hand it directly to the presiding judge." The clerk frowned, ready to argue, but something in his tone gave her pause. She lowered her hand slowly and said, "Wait here." David nodded and stepped back, blending into the space like a shadow. He could feel the curious glances of people nearby, the faint murmurs of speculation, but he ignored them. His focus stayed on the simple case in his palm. Inside it was more than evidence. It was a promise kept, a duty that didn't end when the war did. And as the heavy doors creaked open behind him, letting in a rush of cool air and the sound of footsteps, David Cole had no idea that within minutes, the entire room would see him not as a face in the crowd, but as the man who would force them to remember what dignity looked like when the world tried to shove it down. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was crowded with the usual churn of bodies, lawyers balancing files, nervous families wringing their hands, officers in uniform standing a little too stiffly as if the badge alone gave them gravity. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, that stale courthouse scent that never seemed to leave. David Cole walked toward the heavy double doors with his flash drive still resting in his hand. His steps were steady, but the closer he came, the more he felt the shift in the room, like heat before a storm. 2 officers flanked the entrance, but it was the man in the middle who caught David's eye. Rick Malone. Mid-30s, tall, his uniform pressed so sharp you could cut yourself on the creases. The kind of man who let his boots click loud on tile floors just so people would look his way. His jaw was square, his hair cropped close, and his chest seemed to swell under the badge pinned too proudly over his heart. He wasn't just guarding the door. He was guarding the idea that he belonged there more than anyone else. Malone's eyes tracked David the way a hawk tracks something moving through a field. His gaze slid from the gray at David's temples down to the scuffed leather shoes, and he smirked just faintly, as if the sight confirmed something he already believed. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned slightly against the doorframe, blocking the path. "You lost, old man?" Malone's voice carried across the hallway, casual but cutting, loud enough for the group of law students nearby to hear. A couple of them looked up from their notebooks. David stopped a few feet short, calm in the way he always was. "No," he said evenly. "I'm here for the Johnson case. I was called to testify." He lifted the small case slightly, just enough for Malone to see. "I need to deliver this to the court." Malone's eyes narrowed at the flash drive, though he didn't reach for it. "Testify," he repeated slowly, like the word didn't quite belong in David's mouth. "You sure you're in the right building? The DMV's a few blocks down." A ripple of laughter came from one of the younger officers at his side. Malone didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. He straightened just a little, enjoying the moment. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I was subpoenaed. This evidence is required for the record." Malone tilted his head, studying him. "And you came alone? No lawyer? No one to walk you through where to sit and what to say?" "I wasn't asked to bring one," David replied. "I'm a witness, not a defendant." The smirk grew. Malone leaned forward just slightly, his shadow falling across David's chest. "Funny thing, most witnesses don't walk in looking like they're late to pay a parking ticket." The words hung heavy. A few people on the benches shifted uncomfortably. A clerk at a side desk pretended to stay busy, but her eyes flickered toward them, then back down to her papers. David didn't flinch. He held Malone's gaze and said, "With all due respect, officer, these files aren't yours to handle. They were entrusted to me. I'll deliver them directly to the court. That calmness, that refusal to rise to the bait, seemed to irritate Malone more than anything else. He stepped forward, closing the last bit of space between them, his voice dropping into something quieter, harder. You talk like that flash drive means something, like people in there give a damn about what's in your pocket. David's voice was steady. It does mean something. Malone stared at him for a long moment, then gave a short laugh under his breath, though there was no humor in it. He leaned closer, his breath sharp with coffee. You want people to take you seriously, old man? Maybe you should have shown up looking like someone who belongs in a courthouse. David didn't move. I spent 30 years in the Navy, he said, not boasting, just stating a fact. I've stood in rooms where the rules were life and death. This isn't new to me. The smirk faded, replaced by something colder. Malone's jaw flexed as he straightened. Then you should know what happens when people don't follow protocol. His hand hovered just an inch from David's shoulder, not touching, but threatening. Back up. You're not going in there. David tightened his grip on the case in his hand, his knuckles whitening, but his voice stayed low, controlled. I didn't come here to beg. I came to testify. The words cut through the noise of the hall, and suddenly it felt as if the air itself had paused. The law students stopped scribbling. A man in a suit lowered his phone mid-call. Even a child sitting with his mother at the far bench looked up, curious. The silence was different now, not the hum of a courthouse, but the hush before something breaks. Malone's face hardened. He leaned back just enough to let the tension rise like a rope stretched taut. You've got 2 seconds to move before I make you, he said, his voice flat, dangerous. David stood his ground. I haven't broken any law. You're the one blocking justice. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. They rippled outward, reaching everyone watching. For a beat, no one moved. Not the clerk, not the other officers, not the people scattered on the benches. All eyes were on the man in the plain navy jacket, standing tall, and the officer blocking the door with his badge gleaming like a dare. The moment stretched long and brittle. David could feel the weight of it pressing in. Every breath in the hallway held tight, waiting to see which way it would snap. Malone let the silence hang for just a moment longer, savoring the weight of the eyes on them. He had an audience now, and men like him always performed when they knew people were watching. He shifted his stance, boots scraping against the marble tile, and let his voice carry down the hallway like he was addressing the whole room. You really think this place is for you? He said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. You walk in here like you've got business, but all I see is somebody who doesn't know where he belongs. The younger officer at his side chuckled softly, the sound sharp and out of place in the hushed air. The clerk at her desk froze with a stack of papers in her hands, her eyes darting nervously between the men. She didn't speak, but the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed how wrong the moment felt. David held his ground. His grip on the case tightened, but his voice remained calm, even as though he were speaking in a room without witnesses. I told you, officer. I was called to testify. I have evidence for the court. Malone took a step closer, his shadow stretching over David's chest. He tilted his head, lowering his voice so it slid out like poison. Evidence, he repeated, almost mocking the sound of the word. What kind of evidence could a man like you possibly carry that matters in there? Do you even know what happens inside a courtroom? Or are you just here because somebody told you it might be your big moment? David didn't answer right away. He looked past Malone, at the heavy wooden doors, at the seal carved above them, then back into the officer's eyes. When he spoke, his words were steady. I know enough to understand this isn't about me. It's about the truth. And the truth doesn't belong to you. That was when Malone's smirk faltered. It wasn't gone, but it wavered, like a candle flame caught in the draft. He straightened his posture, puffing his chest to reclaim the authority slipping through his fingers. You talk pretty big for somebody standing here alone, he sneered. Then, louder this time for everyone to hear, he added, but let's be honest. Men like you never belonged in rooms like this. Not in uniform, not out of it. You can dress it up however you want, but at the end of the day, you'll always be what you've always been, out of place. The words cut sharp, heavier than a shove. They weren't just aimed at David. They were meant to sink into the bones of everyone who looked like him, who had ever been told they didn't belong. The insult echoed in the stillness of the hall, bouncing off marble walls and settling into the silence of the crowd. A woman seated with her young daughter near the bench shifted uncomfortably, pulling her child closer. The girl's eyes were wide, confused, staring at David with a question she couldn't put into words. One of the law students set his pen down, jaw clenched, while another lowered her gaze, ashamed by the familiarity of the scene. David's face didn't change. He didn't let the insult register outwardly, though inside he felt the old ache stir, the sting he'd known as a boy on playgrounds, as a sailor in barracks, as a man who had bled for a country that sometimes pretended not to see him. But he had learned long ago that anger was the quickest weapon to hand your enemy. He wouldn't give Malone that satisfaction. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the flash drive case and lifted his chin just slightly. His voice was quiet, but it carried. With all due respect, officer, I'm not here to prove I belong to you. I'm here to do my duty. You can call me whatever you like, but you won't stop me from walking through that door. Malone's nostrils flared. He had expected defiance, maybe even a raised voice, but not this calm, unshakable stillness that left no room for his dominance to expand. For a heartbeat, the officer said nothing. The younger cop beside him shifted uneasily, his earlier smirk fading, as if he too felt the weight of what had been said. Then Malone laughed once, short and bitter. He leaned in close, his voice low enough that only David could hear, though the venom in it made the air around them colder. You think standing there makes you strong? All I have to do is lift a finger, and you'll be on the floor before anyone remembers your name. David's eyes stayed on his. Then lift it, but understand this. You'll be the one blocking justice, not me. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Malone's expression, something unsettled, as if he hadn't expected the older man to stand so calmly on the edge of the threat. But it vanished quickly, buried under the weight of his authority. He pulled back, straightening to his full height, his voice once again pitched for the hallway. That's the problem with men like you, he said, loud and clear. Always talking about justice like it's yours to hand out. But justice doesn't wear your face. Not in here. The line dropped heavy into the silence. The clerk's hand trembled over her papers. A man in a dark suit shifted on his bench, opening his mouth as though to speak but closing it again. The child whispered to her mother, "Why is he saying that?" The woman hushed her quickly, eyes darting down, afraid to meet anyone else's. The sting of the insult wasn't new to David. It was old, older than the gray in his hair, older than the years on his back. But standing there, with the eyes of strangers on him, and the flash drive pressed tight in his palm, he felt a deeper ache. A weary disappointment that after everything, after all the years he had given, this was still the first thing men like Malone chose to see. And yet, he didn't let it bend him. His silence became its own kind of defiance, a wall Malone's words couldn't climb. He stood still, unwavering, his presence alone refusing to shrink. The hallway around them was thick with tension, with shame, with fear, with the quiet hum of a moment that was about to break. David knew the storm hadn't come yet, but it was coming, and when it did, the whole room would feel it. The pause broke like glass. Malone's jaw clenched, and before anyone could move, he shoved David hard in the chest. The older man's body struck the marble floor with a sickening crack that echoed down the hallway. The flash drive flew from his grip, the case skidding across the tiles, spinning once before coming to rest against the base of the clerk's desk. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a sharp intake of breath from a dozen throats, but no one stepped forward. David's palms scraped against the floor as he tried to push himself up, the skin tearing under the weight. He felt the sting of blood before he saw it, a thin line tracing across his hand. For a moment, the whole world tilted, the ceiling lights blurring, the sound of shuffling shoes muffled, the cold bite of stone searing into his ribs. He tasted iron at the corner of his mouth. But what struck him hardest wasn't the pain. It was the silence. There were no cries of protest, no one demanding the officer stop. Just silence. The kind that thickens, that presses down on a room until it feels suffocating. He heard a single voice cut through it, small and high and bewildered. "Mama, why did that man push him? He wasn't doing anything." A child's voice, clear as a bell in the dead air. David turned his head just slightly, catching the sight of a little girl clutching her mother's sleeve, her wide eyes brimming with confusion. The mother pulled her close, her lips parting like she might explain, but no words came. Her face folded inward, shame written across it, as though she wanted to disappear rather than answer. David pressed his hand against the floor and pushed, his muscles straining, but Malone's shadow loomed over him. The officer's stance was broad, arms at his side, daring anyone to object. His chest heaved, but his expression was cold, as if knocking a man down was just part of the job. His boot slid forward an inch, nudging one of the scattered papers like he might grind it under his heel. The clerk behind the desk had risen halfway, her chair pushed back against the wall, eyes wide and hands trembling. One of the law students shifted in his seat, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the screen but too afraid to lift it. A man in a suit cleared his throat like he might intervene, then sat back down, his courage shriveling under the weight of that uniformed glare. David's breath was ragged as he forced himself onto one knee. He could feel the warm trickle of blood sliding down his temple, dripping onto the floor. His hand shook as he gathered one of the sheets that had flown from the folder, folding it gently, as though even in this moment the evidence mattered more than his pain. "Stay down," Malone barked. His voice rang with authority, the kind that relied on fear rather than respect. He stepped closer, towering over David, his badge glinting in the light. "You move again, and I'll make sure you can't get up." But David didn't stay down. He planted his other hand against the marble and rose slowly, painfully, until he was kneeling tall. His face was streaked with blood, his jacket rumpled, but his eyes, those eyes were steady, locked on the man who had thrown him to the ground. He didn't speak, not yet. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. The girl's voice piped up again, softer this time, but trembling with anger. "Why are they hurting him, Mama?" Her small fists were balled tight at her sides. The mother hushed her, whispering, "Don't ask, just don't." But her own eyes glistened, betraying the ache she felt. A young woman in the corner took a step forward, then froze, uncertain if she was brave enough to cross the line between witness and participant. She looked at David and asked quietly, "Are you all right, sir?" David turned his head, blood still dripping, and managed to speak through the haze of pain. "I've been hit harder." His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't broken. It carried the weight of battles fought, scars earned, nights survived. And then he added, more quietly, but not for trying to do the right thing. His words sank into the crowd like stones. No one applauded, no one gasped, but something shifted in the air, something undeniable. People had seen, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Malone's jaw twitched, his composure faltering as the hallway seemed to tilt against him. He had expected compliance, fear, humiliation. Instead, the man he shoved to the ground was standing again, bloody and battered, but unshaken. And worse, he was being watched. David's body trembled as he straightened fully, gathering the scattered papers one by one, ignoring the sting in his palms and the weight in his chest. His silence had become a weapon, every movement an act of defiance. By the time he clutched the last page against his chest, the hallway had changed. People didn't cheer, but their eyes told the story. They had witnessed injustice, and the silence was no longer safe, and Malone knew it. He stood there, trying to hold his ground, but the smirk was gone. In its place was something tight, something uncertain. Because in shoving David Cole to the ground, he hadn't erased him. He had revealed him. A voice rose above the uneasy silence, rough but ringing with conviction. "That man saved my life!" All heads turned toward the far end of the courtroom hall, where a wheelchair rolled forward, its wheels squeaking against the marble floor. Eric Johnson, his shoulders stooped but his presence commanding, pushed himself closer with arms hardened by years of struggle. His voice shook with fury, not weakness. "You think you can throw him down like he's nothing? That man dragged me out of gunfire in Baghdad. He carried me when I couldn't carry myself. You hear me? He carried me with a bullet in his own leg." The crowd stirred. Whispers rippled through the benches, a collective intake of breath. People shifted, looked at one another, then back at David, standing bloodied but tall, clutching the bent pages to his chest. The clerk behind her desk pressed a hand to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. Even the young woman who had hesitated to step forward earlier now leaned toward Eric, as if his words had given her courage. Malone stiffened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He tried to dismiss it with a sneer, but Eric's words rang too loudly. "I watched him bleed for this country," Eric went on, his voice cracking but rising with each syllable. "And now I'm watching him bleed again, right here on the floor of a courthouse. And for what? Because his skin isn't the right color for you to move out of his way?" A hush fell again, but this time it was thick with unease, not compliance. Eyes began to settle on Malone, not with the obedience he had counted on, but with suspicion, even disgust. The badge on his chest no longer gleamed with authority. It looked smaller somehow under the weight of those stares. David, still holding the papers, turned his head slightly toward Eric. Their eyes met across the hallway, and for a moment, time folded back. He could see Eric not in that chair, but in desert sand, his face pale with blood loss, his hand reaching out as David hauled him to safety through smoke and chaos. He remembered the weight of another man's life against his shoulder, the sting of shrapnel in his own leg, the roar of battle in his ears, and he remembered refusing to stop, refusing to let the man die, because that was the oath they had lived by. Never leave a brother behind. Now, standing in a courthouse that had turned its back, he saw the same look in Eric's eyes, the look of a man who refused to let his brother stand alone. "Eric," David said softly, his voice carrying despite the low tone, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Eric interrupted, wheeling himself closer, his hands straining on the rims. "I've stayed quiet long enough. We both have. People need to know who you are." Malone barked, "That's enough." His voice cracked, not from lack of volume, but from the edge of fear sliding into it. He stepped forward, his boots echoing loud against the marble. "This is a courthouse, not story time. Sit down before you what?" Eric shot back, his voice like gravel grinding. "Before you throw me on the ground too? Go ahead, do it. Let every soul in this room see who you really are." The tension crackled, sharp and brittle. People leaned forward, drawn into the spectacle. A young man in the back quietly raised his phone, recording. Another followed. The glow of screens multiplied as more bystanders lifted their cameras, silently documenting what was unfolding. Malone noticed. His eyes darted toward the devices, and for the first time, a bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. He adjusted his stance, suddenly less sure of himself. The swagger was still there, but thinner, fragile under the glare of dozens of unblinking lenses. David took a breath, straightening, his voice calm but steady. "Eric," he said again, "this isn't about me. It's about the truth in these files. That's all." He held the flash drive case higher, though his hand trembled from the scrape across his palm. Eric's jaw tightened. "No, David, it's about more than that now. It's about them knowing you're not just some man they can shove aside. They need to see the man who carried soldiers through hell and never once asked for thanks. They need to see who they just tried to erase." The girl's small voice echoed again, cutting through like a blade of innocence. "Mama, is he a hero?" she whispered. This time her mother didn't hush her. She stared at David with wet eyes and whispered, almost too softly, "Yes, baby, he is." The words traveled like a spark. Whispers grew louder. Heads turned, faces shifted from uneasy silence to recognition. A veteran sitting quietly in the back, his old cap pulled low, gave a single nod. A woman in business attire lowered her phone, her expression changed. The shame of her earlier silence etched across her face. Malone's authority was crumbling, and he felt it. His badge, his uniform, his bark, all the armor he wore wasn't enough to shield him from the weight of truth pressing down on him now. He tried to regain control, his voice booming again. "Everyone quiet down! Back to your seats!" But the command didn't land. It bounced uselessly off the walls. People didn't move. Their eyes stayed fixed on David, on Eric, on the quiet dignity standing in the center of the storm. David breathed in, slow and deliberate. He didn't smile. He didn't rage. He simply stood straighter, bloodied but unbowed, and the room seemed to breathe with him. Eric wheeled himself closer until he was just a few feet away, his hand gripping the rim so hard his knuckles turned white. "You saved me once," Eric said, voice breaking. "I can't let them bury you here. Not this time." The words hung in the air heavy, undeniable. And for the first time since David had stepped into that hallway, Malone wasn't the man commanding the room. David was, not through rank or badge or threats, through presence, through silence, through the echo of a truth too powerful to ignore. David's hands trembled as he gathered the scattered pages, each one bent and smeared, the ink smudged by the thin streak of blood that still ran down his palm. He did not hurry. He didn't let the pain or the heat in his ribs dictate his pace. Each sheet he picked up was placed carefully back into the folder, as though he were restoring order in a world that had just spun out of control. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind that drew every eye because they seemed to say more than words could. The hallway was dead quiet, except for the faint squeak of Eric's wheelchair as he rolled closer, and the shallow breathing of a crowd trying not to betray what they were feeling. Malone's boots clicked as he shifted his weight, a restless sound against the silence. His face was flushed now, not from exertion but from something else, something close to unease, though he'd never admit it. David finally rose from one knee, straightening with effort. His back was rigid, his shoulders squared despite the throbbing ache in his side. He held the flash drive case tight against his chest, his bloodied papers pressed beneath it, and his gaze leveled directly at Malone. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just looked at him, and that look carried all the weight of a man who had endured worse and still refused to bow. "You should have stayed down," Malone muttered, but the edge in his voice was thinner now, strained. He tried to stand taller, but the authority that had filled his voice earlier seemed to have drained out, replaced by something hollow. David's eyes didn't waver. He spoke softly, just loud enough for the hall to hear. "I didn't come here to beg. I didn't come here to crawl. I came here to testify, and I will." The words weren't loud, but they landed heavy, rolling through the onlookers like distant thunder. The law students at the benches exchanged glances, some of them ashamed they hadn't stood sooner, others awed by the calm defiance in his tone. The mother with the little girl stared openly now, her eyes wet, while the girl clutched her hand, whispering, "He's not afraid." Malone's jaw clenched, his hand twitching at his side. He wanted to strike again, to shut the man up, but the moment had shifted. It wasn't just him and David anymore. The crowd was awake now. Their silence wasn't the silence of consent. It was the silence of witnesses. The young woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward at last, her voice trembling but clear. "Sir," she said to David, "let me help you with those." She reached for the bent papers still clutched against his chest, but David shook his head gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm despite the blood on his lips. "But these are mine to carry." The moment pressed tighter around them. A man in a dark suit finally broke the stillness, muttering, "This isn't right," though his words were half swallowed, uncertain. Others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking to Malone, then back to David. The balance was tipping, but not enough to break the dam. David adjusted his jacket, lifted his chin, and began to walk. Each step was slow, not because of weakness, but because he wanted every movement to be measured, to force the room to absorb it. He stepped toward the courtroom doors, his shoes echoing against the marble, and no one moved to stop him. Not Malone, not the younger officers, not the clerk who now stood frozen behind her desk. Malone's hand twitched again, like he might reach out, might block the path once more. But he didn't. Not this time. His eyes followed David, and the heat of all those other eyes followed him too. The authority he had leaned on so carelessly was slipping through his fingers, and the realization showed in the tight set of his jaw. David stopped just short of the doors. He turned his head slightly, not to Malone, but to the crowd, to the people who had sat in silence, to the children who had asked why. His voice was low, but in the hush it carried clear. "You can kick me down," he said, "but I will still stand." The line fell like a hammer, and for a moment no one breathed. Eric's hands clenched on the rims of his chair, his chest rising and falling with pride and fury. The little girl whispered. He stood back up, as though she had witnessed something sacred. Malone swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He didn't move. He didn't speak. For the first time, he seemed smaller than the man standing bloodied and battered before him. David placed one hand against the door, pushing it open. The hinges groaned softly, the light from inside spilling across his face. He didn't look back at Malone, didn't need to. His silence, his very posture, had already said what words could not. And in that heavy, breathless quiet, the crowd knew they had seen something they would never forget. A man who had been struck down, who bled in front of them, and who still rose, unbroken, carrying the truth with him into the chamber where justice was supposed to live. The hush inside the hall deepened, thick enough to press against the skin. David stood at the threshold of the courtroom doors, his hands still on the brass handle, his body carrying the tremor of pain, yet his face locked in calm defiance. Malone loomed a few feet behind, chest heaving, trying to summon back the authority that had slipped through his grasp. But the weight of eyes on him made every breath sound shallow. People clutched their phones tighter, some lifting them higher to capture what they sensed was no longer just a scuffle, but something larger, something that would leave a mark. Then it came, a voice that cut across the silence like a knife. "That man is David Cole." The tone was deep, gravelly, unmistakably authoritative. Heads turned as an older figure rose from the second bench. Tall, broad-shouldered, despite the years, he wore a dark gray suit tailored with quiet precision. A small American flag pin gleamed on his lapel, catching the light. His hair was white, his face weathered, but his eyes were steel. Eyes that carried the weight of wars and command. Whispers shot through the gallery. "Who is that?" someone murmured. The law students leaned forward, pens forgotten, while the clerk's hands froze mid-motion, a paper slipping from her grip. Even Malone faltered, his smirk collapsing into something harder to place. Recognition, maybe even dread. The man stepped into the aisle with the measured grace of someone who knew every gaze was on him, yet had never needed applause. He looked straight at David, not with pity, not with surprise, but with the kind of recognition that comes from shared battlefields. Then he turned his head toward the crowd and spoke again, his voice filling the room without force. "He led men like me into hell and brought us back out again. In Fallujah, in Kandahar, in places most of you only know from headlines. I watched him carry 3 wounded soldiers on his back under enemy fire. One of them was me." A collective gasp spread. The law students glanced at one another in disbelief. The young woman near the benches pressed her trembling hand to her lips, and the little girl whispered, "He's a soldier?" Her mother's eyes filled as she nodded silently. Malone's color drained, but he tried to hide it, shifting his stance, puffing his chest like a man struggling to reclaim ground already lost. "This is irrelevant," he barked, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. "Whoever you are, this has nothing to do with." "It has everything to do with it," the older man snapped back, and though he didn't raise his voice, the rebuke landed like a strike. "Because you don't just see a man you shove to the ground. You see the Navy SEAL who never asked for medals, never asked for recognition, but earned respect the hard way, by saving lives you could never imagine risking." The older man moved closer to David, stopping 3 feet away. The hall seemed to shrink around them, every breath from the crowd caught in their throats. His eyes softened as he looked at David again. Without a word, he raised his right hand to his brow in a crisp, flawless salute. The kind of salute reserved for the highest honor, the kind of salute that told the room exactly who David Cole was. David's chest tightened. For a moment, behind the steel calm in his eyes, there was a flicker of pain, not from his bruised ribs or the blood on his palm, but from the weight of being seen when he had come only to serve quietly. He had not asked for this moment, not wanted it, but it was here, undeniable. Slowly, with dignity carved deep into every movement, he returned the salute. The room didn't breathe. Some people stood instinctively, reverence pulling them upward. Others lowered their eyes, guilt pricking at their silence. A veteran in the back row straightened his faded cap, his lips pressed together as though holding back tears. Even the reporters, usually vultures in moments like these, forgot to scribble, their pens hanging motionless over pads. Malone took a step back, his boots heavy, his jaw twitching. The badge on his chest suddenly looked like tin, and the swagger that had filled him was stripped bare. He glanced at the crowd, then back at David, and for the first time since he had stepped into that hallway, he had no words. Eric wheeled himself forward, stopping beside David, his voice breaking as he said, "He never told anyone, not even me. He gestured toward the older man still standing at attention. But you just reminded this room who they put on the ground. The older man lowered his salute, always nodded once toward David, and then addressed the crowd again. Remember this moment. Remember who stood back up. Dignity doesn't need a badge. It doesn't need to shout. It simply refuses to fall when the world tries to erase it. A murmur swelled through the room, not loud, not chaotic, like the sound of a tide rising, inevitable. Phones captured every second, lenses gleaming under the harsh courthouse lights. People knew, without saying it out loud, that this would not stay inside these walls. It would travel. It would spread. David lowered his hand, his chest still heaving, his eyes steady as he looked ahead. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply stood, bloodied but unbroken, while the silence around him shifted from fear to reverence. And in that silence, every soul in the room understood that the man they had watched fall moments ago had become something far greater. He was no longer just a witness. He was the embodiment of a truth they could no longer ignore. The salute still lingered in the air, but when David lowered his hand, the silence that followed felt heavier than any roar of applause. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just stood or sat frozen, as if sound itself had forgotten how to exist. David's breath came slow, measured, each inhale stinging his ribs where Malone had shoved him, each exhale steadying the storm inside his chest. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to explain. His body, battered and bloodied, was speaking loud enough. The older general's words echoed in the room like the toll of a distant bell, reverberating long after his voice had gone quiet. Dignity doesn't need a badge. It doesn't need to shout. People held onto that line, turning it over in their minds, feeling the weight of it. A few heads bowed, ashamed of their silence just moments ago. The law students scribbled in frantic bursts, as if desperate not to lose the details of what had just unfolded before their eyes. The mother held her daughter tight, whispering something no one could hear, while the little girl kept her eyes fixed on David, as though watching a story she would never forget. Malone shifted on his feet, sweat gleaming at the edge of his hairline. His jaw flexed, but his mouth didn't open. For the first time in his career, words failed him. His badge caught the light, but where once it had gleamed with the power of authority, now it seemed almost gaudy, a cheap piece of metal compared to the quiet steel of the man who had risen from the floor without a single word of complaint. David adjusted the folder in his hands. The bent papers pressed firmly against his chest, and he began to walk toward the courtroom doors again. His steps were slow, deliberate, echoing like a drumbeat that no one dared to interrupt. People parted instinctively as he passed, some lowering their eyes, others locking their gaze onto him as if trying to etch the sight into memory. His silence was not weakness. It was a roar, a demand, and everyone could hear it. The young woman who had offered to help him earlier clasped her hands in front of her, her throat tight with emotion. She whispered under her breath, maybe only to herself, "This isn't just a witness. This is history." A man nearby caught the words, and instead of shaking his head or dismissing her, he nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with the same recognition. Eric rolled closer, his chair squeaking as he pushed forward with raw determination. "Keep walking, brother," he murmured, his voice cracked but fierce. "Don't let them take this from you." His hand trembled on the wheel rim, but his gaze burned with loyalty, the bond of men who had once faced death side by side. David paused just before the doors, Massa turning his head slightly. His eyes swept over the hall, not just the faces of strangers, but the collective weight of a society that had failed him here, again and again in different forms. He saw the shame, the fear, the awe. And then he spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with the same quiet that had carried him through battlefields and sleepless nights. "I did not come to fight," he said. "I came to tell the truth." The words settled into the silence like embers into dry grass. For a moment no one moved, and then the shift began. One man in the back stood, not clapping, not shouting, just standing tall. Then another followed, and another. Within seconds, half the hall was on its feet. Not one of them spoke, but the sound of bodies rising in unison was louder than any applause. Malone's face twisted, anger and fear warring in his eyes. He turned sharply toward the crowd, his voice cracking as he tried to reassert control. Everyone sit down. This is a courthouse, not a circus. But his words carried no weight anymore. They fell flat, ignored, drowned under the silence that honored David more than any command Malone had ever given in uniform. David turned away from him, not granting him another second of his gaze. He placed his palm against the wooden door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned, the light from inside flooding across his battered face, making the blood on his temple glisten like a mark of sacrifice. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the threshold, and for a heartbeat it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. The general lowered himself back onto the bench, his eyes never leaving David's back. He leaned toward the person next to him, a young reporter with trembling hands, and said quietly, "Remember this. Tell it right. Don't let them twist what you just saw." The reporter nodded furiously, his recorder already running, his mind racing with the enormity of the story in his hands. Eric wheeled up until he was just at the line of the doors, his voice breaking as he called after David. "You stood up once on a battlefield when all of us thought we'd never make it out. You're standing up again now. Don't think for a second we don't see you." David stopped only long enough to turn his head slightly, offering his friend the faintest nod. Then he disappeared into the courtroom, the heavy doors closing behind him with a sound that felt like history sealing itself shut. The silence that remained was not the silence of fear anymore. It was reverence. It was shame. It was awe. And it was louder than any gavel, louder than any verdict, louder than anything Malone could ever shout. It was the sound of a truth too big to be buried, too powerful to be silenced. The first video appeared online less than an hour after the doors closed behind David. Grainy at first, shaky from someone's trembling hand, it showed exactly what everyone in that hallway had witnessed. The shove, the fall, the blood, the silence that followed, and finally, the salute that broke it. By the time the clip had been reposted a dozen times, the image sharpened, captions appeared, hashtags lit up feeds across the country. Stand with David. It was simple, but it spread like fire through dry grass. By the evening, the courthouse had turned from a place of dusty routine into the epicenter of something larger than itself. Outside on the steps, clusters of veterans in worn jackets stood shoulder to shoulder, some leaning on canes, others holding faded photographs of younger versions of themselves in uniform. Reporters crowded them, cameras flashing, as one after another spoke not only of David, but of their own quiet humiliations, the times they had been overlooked or brushed aside despite their service. Their voices wove together into a chorus of long-buried truths. On the internet, the clip of David being shoved down became impossible to avoid. News anchors replayed it between political debates and celebrity scandals, their voices steady but their eyes betraying unease. "A decorated veteran, assaulted in a courthouse," one anchor said, shaking his head, all while trying to testify. His co-anchor added, "And it's not just any veteran. Rumors are already circulating about his record as a Navy SEAL, one of the most decorated in his unit." In a dim apartment across town, Eric sat before his television, tears welling as he watched strangers chant David's name on the courthouse steps. His wheelchair creaked as he leaned forward, his hand pressed against the screen as though reaching for his friend. "They see you now, brother," he whispered. "They finally see you." Malone's name didn't take long to surface either. The same reporters who had once glanced over internal affairs reports with disinterest now dug up complaints that had been buried for years. Excessive force, racial bias, intimidation. Each headline stung sharper than the last. Officer under fire after viral courtroom assault. 5 prior complaints against officer ignored. The badge that had once gleamed like protection now gleamed like a target. Inside the courthouse, staff whispered. Some avoided Malone in the hallways, their eyes dropping to the floor. Others, emboldened by the storm outside, quietly admitted they had seen his temper before, that they were not surprised. He walked with the same swagger, his boots striking hard against the tile, but the air had changed. Where once people stepped aside out of fear, now they watched him with something closer to contempt. Meanwhile, David said nothing. He didn't appear on television. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post on social media. While the world debated his name, he sat quietly with Eric, the folder of bent papers resting on his lap, as if that simple act protecting what he had come to deliver was all that mattered. His silence, however, only amplified the noise outside. People projected their own voices into the void he left, and those voices grew louder, angrier, more resolute. By the third day, the courthouse steps were filled from morning to night. Signs bobbed above the crowd. He fought for us. Fight for him. Justice for David. Dignity has no color. Veterans wrapped their medals around handmade banners. Families brought children, teaching them with their presence what history looked like when it unfolded, not in books, but before their eyes. Reporters lined the sidewalks, broadcasting live shots that caught chants swelling up and echoing through downtown Birmingham. Maya, the young law student who had hesitated to raise her phone in the heat of the moment, now found herself at the center of the storm. Her footage was the clearest, the longest, the one that captured not just the shove, but the look in David's eyes when he stood back up. She had tried to remain anonymous, but the world found her anyway. Interview requests poured in. Professors called her brave. Strangers called her a hero, and yet when asked, she shook her head. I'm not the hero. He is. I just held up my phone. At night in cities far from Birmingham, candlelight vigils appeared in parks and outside veterans' halls. Old men in wheelchairs, women in military caps, teenagers holding flags. They gathered not for spectacle, but for solidarity. They lit candles in silence, some whispering prayers, some staring into the flames as if trying to summon courage. A radio host in Chicago ended his program with a tremor in his voice. Maybe David doesn't need to speak, because this time the country is finally speaking for him. Even politicians, cautious and slow to commit, began to issue statements. Words like unacceptable, deeply troubling, demanding accountability filled press releases. The governor dodged questions at first, but after a week of protests, his hesitation became its own scandal. Public approval dipped, pressure mounted, and the demand for an independent investigation became too loud to ignore. But David remained still. In Eric's apartment, he sat on the porch some evenings, the Alabama air thick and humid, his gaze distant as shouts and chants from blocks away carried faintly through the night. He never sought the cameras, never asked for the chance. His silence wasn't apathy, it was conviction. He had spoken in the only way he believed mattered, by standing back up. And yet that silence became a symbol. It was quoted in articles, painted on signs, shared across social media. People held it up as proof that dignity didn't need speeches or slogans. It only needed a man who refused to stay down when the world tried to put him on the floor. In those days, the storm swelled. The courthouse was no longer just a building of marble and wood. It was a battleground of memory, justice, and truth. And at the center of it all stood a man who said nothing, yet whose silence had become the loudest voice in the country. The hearing room in Washington felt different than the courthouse in Birmingham, but the tension was the same. Polished wood, rows of chairs filled with reporters, politicians shifting uneasily in their suits, the air humming with the weight of anticipation. David sat at the front, not in the witness box yet, but in a plain chair beside Eric. His jacket was simple, his hands folded calmly over the folder he had carried from the start, now patched and taped at the corners from the ordeal it had survived. He had been flown here under the eye of men who wanted his presence to quiet the outrage, to make it look as if justice was finally listening. But David wasn't here for optics. He wasn't here to please anyone. Cameras clicked, lights glared, but he didn't shift under the pressure. Eric leaned toward him, voice low, steadying his nerves, though he knew David didn't need it. "They're waiting for you, brother. Say what they need to hear. Say it for all of us." David glanced at him, his face calm, his voice even softer. "I already did. That day when I stood back up, that was my speech." Eric shook his head, frustrated, but he couldn't argue. Deep down he knew David meant it. At the long table, the chairman of the committee cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly. The room stilled. "We are convened to discuss the treatment of veterans in public institutions, and more specifically, the events that took place last week at the Jefferson County Courthouse." His voice was official, heavy with rehearsed importance. "Mr. David Cole, you have been asked to speak. The country is listening." Every lens in the room trained on David. He rose slowly, not rushing, the creak of his chair legs audible in the hush. He walked to the stand with the quiet confidence of someone who had been under fire before, who had heard the whistling of bullets far closer than the questions of politicians. When he sat, he didn't fidget or shuffle papers. He simply rested his hands on the wood in front of him, his eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on the rows of cameras at the back. The chairman leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, would you like to make a statement?" David's pause stretched long enough that some reporters shifted in their seats. Finally he spoke, voice low but carrying. "I bled for this flag, not for applause, not for permission, but for justice." He let the words sink in, each syllable deliberate. "And when I was thrown to the ground that day, I did what I've always done. I got back up." Murmurs rippled through the gallery, pens scratching frantically, cameras flashing brighter. The chairman tried to press. "And is there anything else you'd like to add, sir? Anything you'd want this country to know?" David's eyes steadied, calm as stone. "No, I said what I needed to say in the way I stood." The room froze. The simplicity of it was disarming, almost defiant. One senator leaned forward, clearly irritated. "Mr. Cole, you understand the gravity of this? You've sparked protests across the nation. People want words, they want guidance." David turned his gaze on him, not unkind but unflinching. "Then let them look at what happened. Let them look at a man shoved down for nothing but the color of his skin. Let them look at the silence that followed. If they need guidance, it's already there. I don't need to add to it." The senator swallowed hard and leaned back, chastened. In the gallery, Eric's eyes filled. He whispered to the woman beside him, though she didn't know him. "That's him. That's always been him." Quiet, but louder than anyone in the room. A few reporters couldn't help but break the rule of silence, whispering among themselves. "That's the quote. That's the headline. I said what I needed to say in the way I stood." The committee chair cleared his throat again, attempting to regain control. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. We will take your statement under consideration." His voice trembled just slightly as he moved to the next order of business, but everyone in the room knew the story had already been written. As David left the stand, the silence that followed him wasn't uneasy anymore. It was reverent. Senators shifted in their seats, some avoiding his gaze, others watching him as though they were witnessing something they hadn't seen in years, a man who didn't need power to command respect. Eric wheeled up beside him as they moved toward the exit, his voice thick with pride. "You shook this whole room without even raising your voice." David gave the faintest of smiles, though his eyes carried the same weary weight. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Standing, not shouting, just standing." As they stepped into the bright corridor outside, reporters swarmed, microphones reaching, cameras flashing. Questions flew in a storm. "Mr. Cole, what do you say to the protests? Do you want Officer Malone prosecuted? What do you want from Congress?" David didn't break stride. He walked through the chaos with Eric beside him, the flash of lights reflecting off the case still clutched in his hand. He didn't give them the soundbite they craved. His silence was his answer, and it thundered louder than any shouted demand. By the time he reached the doors of the building, chants from outside grew audible, voices rising in unison from the crowd gathered on the steps. "Stand with David." Over and over, the words rolled like waves. As he emerged into the sunlight, the crowd fell into a hush, thousands of eyes on him. He stopped at the top of the steps, gazed at them quietly, and simply lifted the folder in his hand. The roar that followed shook the street, but David didn't flinch. He stood there, tall and calm, letting the noise wash over him. His silence was complete, and yet it said everything. And the country, for once, was listening. The storm that followed the hearing did not ease. If anything, it grew louder, heavier, more relentless with each passing day. Officer Rick Malone's name was everywhere now. Headlines splashed his face across television screens, his smirk captured in screenshots from old photos, paired with words like suspended, under investigation, and accused of misconduct. The department tried to put distance between themselves and him, issuing stiff statements about upholding standards, but the public wasn't buying it anymore. People had seen too much. They had seen him shove a man to the ground who had given more to this country than he could ever comprehend. Malone walked the halls of the precinct differently now. The swagger was still there in his stride, but his eyes darted quicker, his mouth tighter. Some of his fellow officers wouldn't meet his gaze. Others watched him with quiet calculation, the kind of look that told him he was no longer untouchable. He tried to laugh it off, dismiss it as political theater, but the truth gnawed at him. The world outside wasn't the same anymore, and the badge he wore no longer carried the shield he believed it did. David stayed far from that noise. Back in Birmingham, he spent most of his days at Eric's small apartment. The two men sat together often without words, the kind of silence only men who had bled side by side could understand. Sometimes Eric would speak, voice low and raw, about the desert heat or the memory of gunfire echoing through the night. Sometimes David would nod, his face unreadable, and sailed it through. Most of the time, though, they simply sat, two shadows bound by history, listening to the muffled chants from protests down the street. Maya found her way to them one evening, her hands shaking as she knocked on Eric's door. When David opened it, she stood there with her phone clutched to her chest like a fragile relic. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't not record it. And now it's everywhere." David stepped aside, letting her in. "You did what was right," he told her simply. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that softened when he looked at her. "The truth needs witnesses. You were brave enough to be one." Maya sat across from him, tears brimming. "You don't understand. People are calling me a hero. Me. I was terrified. I almost put the phone down." Eric gave a short, rough laugh. "Heroes aren't the ones without fear, kid. They're the ones who act anyway. You carried the truth out of that courthouse when everyone else kept their heads down." Her tears slipped free then, but she smiled faintly, and for the first time she believed it. In the days that followed, pressure on the system mounted. The judge who had presided over the hearing in silence that day was suddenly facing questions, not from whispering colleagues, but from federal oversight boards. The press demanded to know why he had let violence play out in his own courtroom without so much as a word. Every time he tried to dodge the questions, another headline hit harder. The image of David bleeding on that floor was too powerful to ignore. At night, the news channels filled with panels of veterans, civil rights leaders, and everyday citizens who replayed the same clip over and over. They dissected it, analyzed the silence, the salute, the way David's words, few as they were, had spread across the nation like gospel. "I said what I needed to say in the way I stood." That line appeared on banners at rallies, across social media, even etched into cardboard signs hoisted by children in the crowd. It was no longer just about David. It was about every man or woman who had been told to stay down and refused. Eric was asked to appear on television one evening. He hesitated, but David insisted. "They need to hear your voice," he said. "You lived it with me. Tell them the truth." So Eric went, wheeled onto a small stage lit by harsh studio lights, his medals pinned neatly to his chest. When the anchor asked him what David meant to him, he didn't speak right away. His jaw trembled, his eyes moist. But when he did speak, his voice carried the weight of every soldier who had been left behind. "He once dragged me through sand with bullets cracking the ground around us. He refused to let me die, even when he was bleeding himself. That's the man they shoved to the ground. That's the man who stood back up. And if the law won't listen to him, then who will it listen to?" The clip spread almost as fast as the original video. Veterans across the country echoed his words, sending in their own testimonies, holding up faded photos of David or of men like him who had been forgotten. Churches lit candles. Marchers filled city streets. The chant grew louder, "Stand with David." Meanwhile, David kept to himself. He refused every request for interviews, every plea for a statement. "The more I talk," he said quietly to Eric and Maya one evening, "the more they'll twist it. My silence is enough." He sat back, eyes distant, as if remembering battles that had nothing to do with microphones or marble floors. And yet, that silence only made the world lean in closer. His absence from the stage made his presence loom larger, his figure turning into something more than just a man. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. And as Eric wheeled beside him on that porch, and Maya sat on the steps with her phone resting idle in her lap, they all knew the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. Because now, the country wasn't just watching Malone or the judge or even the courthouse. They were watching themselves, measuring their silence against David's and asking which one history would remember. The statue was unveiled on a gray morning, the kind of day when clouds hung low, but the air carried a quiet sense of occasion. There were no fireworks, no marching bands, no politicians fighting for camera angles. Just a small crowd gathered at the base of the courthouse steps, their breath visible in the cool air, their voices hushed with the reverence that comes when people know they are standing in front of something larger than themselves. The bronze figure sat on a simple bench, not towering or commanding, but still. David Cole, captured not in uniform or in battle, but in the moment that had changed everything. Seated, jacket plain, a folder resting gently on his lap, his eyes fixed forward with a calm, steady gaze. There was no fist raised, no sword drawn, just the quiet posture of a man who refused to be erased. The artist had captured the faint crease in his brow, the hint of wariness at the corners of his eyes, but also the strength that lay beneath it all, the strength of a man who had stood when the world told him to stay down. At the base of the statue, a plaque gleamed in the morning light. The inscription was short, only 10 words. He stood without shouting. He moved the world. People lingered on those words, reading them over and over, as if trying to absorb their weight into their own bones. Eric was there, wheeled close to the statue, his old service cap pulled low over his forehead. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them in salute, not to a government, not to a system that had failed them, but to his brother, immortalized in metal but alive in the hearts of everyone present. His voice cracked as he whispered under his breath, "For the man who saved me twice, once on the battlefield, once in a courthouse." Maya stood a few feet away, her phone in hand, though she wasn't recording for virality this time. She simply let the lens frame the statue, her hands steady, her eyes damp. This wasn't about posting or proving anymore. This was about remembering. For her, the statue was less a monument and more a promise, a vow that what she had witnessed would not be buried under silence again. The small crowd shifted as a familiar pair appeared at the edge of the square. A little girl, the same child who had once tugged at her mother's sleeve in the courthouse hall, walked forward, her small hand clasped in her mother's. She stopped in front of the statue, her eyes wide, her face illuminated by something close to awe. "Mama," she whispered, "he's the one who stood up when no one else did." Her mother nodded, her own throat tight. "Yes, baby, he is." The girl stared a moment longer, then added, barely louder than a breath, "One day, I want to be like him." There was no applause at her words, no cheer, just a heavy, respectful silence that seemed to ripple through the gathering. It was the kind of silence that David himself had always carried, quiet, steady, more powerful than any speech. Behind the statue, through the courthouse windows, the work of change had already begun. Training protocols were rewritten, complaints once buried were being reopened, and officers whispered about reforms they never thought would come. Malone was gone, stripped of his badge, his name forever tethered to the image of the shove that backfired. The judge who had sat in silence faced his own inquiry, his reputation shattered by what he chose not to say. The system had not collapsed, but it had cracked, and through the cracks light had begun to filter in. Across the country, schools began telling the story. Veterans wore pins with David's initials. Churches lit candles, not in protest, but in remembrance. Online, debates raged, but in the end, one truth always surfaced. Dignity, once revealed, could not be hidden again. David himself never returned to the courthouse after that day. He didn't need to. He visited his wife's grave every Sunday, laying fresh flowers, sitting quietly with the wind in the trees. Sometimes Eric rolled up beside him, laying a folded flag at the base of the stone. Sometimes Maya joined them, just to sit and listen. But David always let the silence speak first. On that morning of the unveiling, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Eric remained beside the statue, his hand resting on his lap, his eyes lifted toward the bronze figure that seemed both so ordinary and so extraordinary at once. "You never asked for any of this," he murmured, "but you gave it anyway." The breeze stirred a single white flower left at the statue's feet, its petals trembling in the cool air. The crowd was gone now, the square almost empty, but the silence that lingered wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive. It was the silence of reverence, of memory, of promise. And if you stood there long enough, Looking into those bronze eyes, you could almost hear the echo of that courthouse moment, the thud of papers hitting marble, the hush of a crowd too afraid to speak, and then the steady rise of a man who refused to stay down. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't demanded, he had simply stood. And in doing so, he moved a city, then a country, and perhaps even the course of history itself.